students and recent graduates and grassroots activists to be our speakers this year. You know, these are wonderful people working in the cultural resource management field who may not typically be selected to speak at a traditional preservation conference. And the work being done is incredible. And if you've had the ability to tune in this week, I'm sure you're like me and you have a billion new ideas and a wonderful assortment of case studies and all these things to expand our toolkits, because I mean, this has just been an incredibly motivational week, if I'm being honest. So I'm glad you're all here for this afternoon, again, to explore communities in different ways. And it's a free event thanks to the support of the Alpha Wood Foundation, Eileen and Norman Tyler, and Museum Hacks. So thank you everyone for being here and for sharing this space with us. We'll have back-to-back presentations followed by a moderated Q&A. Feel free to throw your questions into the Q&A box or in the chat, whichever you prefer. We'll be keeping an eye on them. So we're gonna start out with Johanna.
All right, ready to go?
We are good when you are.
Okay. So hi, everyone. My name is Johanna Berliner. I use they and he pronouns. I'm a recent graduate, 2020, of the University of Washington Museology program. So in doing museum evaluation and research. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about my research into transgender visitors' experiences in museums made possible by the graduate program from spring of 2020. So the purpose of the study was to understand trans visitors' experiences of inclusion and exclusion in museums by asking in what contexts and in what ways visitors experience inclusion and exclusion. For me, the significance of this study is really about having data. There's not a lot of research, empirical research done into trans visitors' experiences in museums. There's been some research into other underrepresented groups in museums, including gays and lesbians, but not trans visitors specifically. So I wanted to be able to pull data there that can better help advocates and allies and accomplices understand the barriers that trans visitors may face, and to be able to make a more powerful case for trans inclusion if data may be what may be holding that, that work back at institutions. So for this study, I connected 20 trans and non-cisgender adults in Seattle and in the Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina region to a local museum. They were able to choose from several museums and received complimentary admission. And then they followed up with me afterwards for individual interviews over Zoom. And I want to just mention that all of the visits were conducted before the pandemic, if that helps contextualize what was going on at the time. So the biggest conclusion was that visitors' experiences of inclusion and exclusion generally occurred in the same contexts. So these are kind of 3 points of greatest impact on a visit experience, whether positive or negative. And those are exhibits and other museum content, including museum interpretive materials, interactions with frontline staff, and restroom access. So I'll be talking about each of these in terms of what participants found inclusive, exclusive, and what they consider to be priorities for change to make the museum more inclusive in the future. So in exhibits, content reflective of gender diversity and queer and trans experiences was a big factor in participants feeling included in the museum. So this could be art by trans artists or reflection of gender diversity and history, anything that was reflective of those experiences. As well as representation for other underrepresented groups, whether or not it related to participants' own social identities. So some participants saw exhibits related to contemporary Indigenous groups, and even though they themselves were not Indigenous, they felt included through seeing other kinds of inclusion in the museum. One participant described this as being included by proxy. And to a lesser extent, just a general focus on progressive themes or social justice, which provided participants with the sense that the museum was a welcoming space, even if there wasn't, this was more of like a feeling of welcoming rather than anything material that was showing, we do include these groups. In exhibits, sorry, there's 2 cats playing in the background here. In exhibits, participants felt excluded when they felt that trans or queer content that did exist in a museum felt inauthentic or misguided or sidelined in some way. Some perceived that LGBTQ topics were given less thought or space than other topics in the museum, as well as just a discomfort with narratives presented in LGBTQ displays. They also felt excluded when there was content that reinforced cisnormativity or heteronormativity, binary gender roles, or male-centered perspectives, including the use of gendered language, like every woman who gets an ultrasound to see her baby felt exclusive to them. And they also noted an absence of content reflecting gender diversity in museums. Often participants described what they felt were missed opportunities for discussion of trans issues or gender diversity in particular exhibits. So either historical figures that they felt could be talked about in particular exhibits, or ways that gender diversity could be integrated into existing spaces. Some exhibits labeled LGBTQ contained no trans-related content. And some participants also pointed out that generally, trans representation was only included in a special exhibition or an event, rather than integrated throughout the museum. So participants' priorities for change were generally just seeing queer and trans-related exhibits in the museum, particularly integrated permanently throughout a collection, and seeing inclusive exhibits featuring other underrepresented groups. For staff, this feels very obvious, but equal and equitable treatment by staff contributed to feelings of inclusion, which generally included feeling welcome and perceiving that they were being treated equally as compared to other guests. The use of non-gendered language, so refraining from referring to a group as ladies or ma'am or sir, as well as some participants felt reassured by seeing other gender non-conforming staff on the front lines. And as well, unequal treatment by staff led to feelings of exclusion, which generally manifested in misgendering or perceived different or negative treatment. For these participants, this could include perceived looks or stares. One participant described a "why are you here" look, and staff unwillingness to engage, particularly seeing other guests not treated that way. So seeing staff members kind of ignoring a participant, but then greeting other guests with more exuberance. So priorities for change for participants in terms of staff were the use of non-gendered language and general awareness of implicit biases and adjusting behavior accordingly. One participant urged museums to train everybody not just on political correctness, but on humanizing folks. So wanting not just to be given a list of things to do or not do or say or not say, but to really examine biases and to see guests as individuals and as humans rather than as problems to be solved. And then for restrooms, access to restrooms that are safe and appropriate was the biggest factor in inclusion. And this is mostly in the presence of gender neutral restrooms. I want to note that participants and I in conversation generally used the term gender neutral restrooms, but best practice for signage for a restroom anyone can use is usually all gender restroom. And the lack of access to restrooms that are appropriate and safe was probably the most consistent factor across the board in exclusion. It was mentioned by the majority of participants at some point in our interviews. Generally, this was because there were no gender neutral restrooms or participants were not able to find them. Either there was unclear signage or they were far away from the traditionally gendered restrooms, or they were not clear whether or not they were gender neutral restrooms. So the biggest takeaway that I had from this section is that restrooms shape museum visits. Participants often mentioned that assessing their restroom setup and figuring out which one to use is a regular part of their routine when going into any kind of public place, such as a museum. Their routines included not drinking anything before a visit, looking at a map immediately upon arrival, or figuring out where else in the area there are safe restrooms, so that if they need to cut a visit short, which was also mentioned often, they knew where to go. So uncertainty about restroom access affects physical health as well as personal safety, and it's a huge factor in deciding where to go for activities. And obviously, this is something that we have less control over. It's a facilities issue. But single stall restrooms can be designated as all gender. Museums that have separate gendered facilities can create policies on restroom use to reassure guests that they won't be harassed for the restroom that they are using, that they'll be able to safely take care of their needs. So there are lots of resources for clear restroom signage out there. There's not time to get into all of this here. And a few last conclusions. A lot of participants wanted to see museums making efforts to be in dialogue with trans communities, and expressed an interest in the outcome of studies like this. So they do care and have a stake in museum practice and want to see museums doing good work. Most of the participants in this study had positive relationships with museums, even if they had negative experiences during their visit. So it's something that they're still invested in, even if their experiences aren't wholly positive. The other thing I want to highlight is that trans individuals' experiences don't exist in a vacuum, but they're affected by and compounded with other aspects of their identities, like race, class, sexuality, disability. A lot of their experiences, they didn't pull out between different factors of their identities. A lot of them were really interconnected. So any effort towards trans inclusion needs to be rolled into other kinds of inclusion and equity efforts. So a few possibilities for next steps are examining museum content. Is gender diversity reflected throughout the museum? What kinds of content is there? Is it compartmentalized or is it integrated throughout a collection? Do frontline staff and staff who don't generally interface with the public get cultural competency training? Is there familiarity with gender diversity among staff? And then what are restroom policies? If there aren't any, can policies be made? What kind of signage can be posted to make restroom access really clear and safe? So those are some next steps into possibilities for trans inclusion in museums. So thank you very much for having me.
Oh, thank you. And I know we'll go into more of the Q&A, but it already feels like a lot of your takeaways are things that we can not only do to improve our connections to visitors, but also coworkers and our volunteers, and just better connecting and making sure people feel included and safe and comfortable. I'm gonna pass the mic over to Ricky.
Let me pull up my slides real quick. So redefining Mexican-ness and profit. My slides have a lot of text on them. If you don't like reading text, that's totally fine. We'll walk through it. It doesn't necessarily all need to be read. A little bit about me. So I graduated in May of 2020 with a double major in Mexican American Studies and History. And through that, I really wanted to focus on oral histories and a lot of the memories that are behind that, a lot of the stories that we usually don't get told because we're so focused on things like history books or what the straight facts are, that we never go to the people themselves that the stories are about. I'm currently training as a 911 dispatcher, so I consider myself a community researcher because that's what I spend all of my free time doing, even though I don't necessarily get paid for it. I really do enjoy that. And then I also volunteer at the Mexican-American Museum here in Tucson, and I'm a research volunteer for Teatro Carmen. I started doing research on Teatro Carmen a couple years ago, and then the building ended up getting picked to do remodel, which worked really well with my research. So now I'm getting to implement that in some of these things that I'll be talking about. So what and where's Teatro Carmen? It's located downtown Tucson, Tucson, Arizona, in Barrio Viejo. And it was first owned by Carmen Soto Vasquez, and she had the building commissioned. And this picture down here, the bottom right, is the only picture that we have of when the building was initially made. It opened on March 20th, 1950, and it was the only all Spanish live theater. And it was advertised as holding 1,400 people, but going inside, it's pretty small. This 13,593 square feet is the combination of the fruit store and the actual theater itself. The first performance was Cielo y Corazón, and that was written by a local female poet, which was really interesting. And a short history. So Carmen Soto Vasquez was actually the owner of the property. And that's something that's not really talked about a lot, is a lot of the properties here in town, especially familial properties, were held in the woman's name, not necessarily the man's name. And that was something that I came across while talking to people about the building. A lot of people just said, oh, that theater that's named after that woman. No, she was the reason it was built. She ran the building, and it was in her name up until she died. So she owned the building for 13 years before she died, after she had it commissioned. And it opened in June of 1915. She ended up installing a couple months later a cinematographic machine so that moving pictures could be played in it. And she was actually a stakeholder in a film company that was located across the street. So the film company would go into the theater, record the film, process it across the street, and then it would show in the theater nightly movies. It ended up being remodeled in 1916, and it was advertised under new management, but Carmen was still the owner of the building itself. She still had a say over what happened within it, even though she wasn't directly managing it. And then we start to see the introduction of combinations, movies, and live performances. Then in 1919, possibly to get more involvement in the theater itself, boxing matches started to be held, which is kind of a strange combination because movies were still being shown at that time. So you could one day watch a boxing match and the next day go and see a moving picture or a live performance. There also started to be live performances in English at this point. And then in 1922, a letter was written to Carmen Soto Vasquez, who was no longer living in Tucson. She had moved to be closer to her family, and the High Risk Ridge Parent Teachers Association reached out to her to ask if they would be able to use the building as an Americanization house outside of the hours that it was being used as everything else. And Carmen wrote back and she agreed. And really the main purpose of this building at this point, it was being used as a community center, but then it started to be used for English education because it was a majority Spanish-speaking neighborhood, and sewing machines were brought in because it was thought that women did not know how to repair their children's clothes, and that was prohibiting them from going to school. Other types of classes were taught. One newspaper detailed ballroom dancing that went on in there. It really became more of a community center, but aimed at trying to teach Mexicans in the barrio how to be more American, and the name really portrays that. It ended up being renamed the Community House because people thought Americanization house meant that it was a naturalization center, and it was not. It was just there to try to teach people English and to act more American. The building ended up closing between 1925 and 1926. It remained in the Soto Vasquez family until 1938 when it was sold to the Elks Club as a segregated Elks Club. Talking to people in the community, it was primarily used as a Blacks Elks Club. It wasn't just necessarily like any person of color Elks Club. So there was still some separation in there at that point. Borderlands Theater also came in and rented it out from them until the roof caved in, and then it sat empty. But in the meantime, between being sold, between being an Elks Club in 1925, 1926, it rotated through its uses. Barrio Viejo itself, it's one of the surrounding downtown barrios, and it was originally set to be demolished in 1968, but the city of Tucson decided that they didn't want to pay for displacing all of those families since many were low income, and they didn't want to build the housing that would be necessary for that. So Teatro Carmen is just up the street, less than a block away from having been demolished. And then in 1971, the Rollings family began buying up property. They realized that the adobe houses were going to be worth a lot because at that point, the city of Tucson had demolished like acres of adobe houses that were original and already over 100 years old. Teatro Carmen was included in that. They were suing the city of Tucson because they didn't like how the building had fallen into disrepair. And so it sat empty. And while this was happening, as the Rollings bought up literally the entire street, Barrio Viejo became gentrified. And so we really see that in 1915, the Tucson itself was majority Hispanic or Mexican. And by 1920, it was a 50-50 split between Mexican and white. And currently today in Barrio Viejo, 52.6% of the population identifies as white, which is 7.1% more than the total population of the city of Tucson. So you really do have a high density of people who are identifying as white in that particular neighborhood that was historically a Mexican or Mexican-American neighborhood. The same for the zip codes, where it used to be a primarily Spanish-speaking neighborhood, and now only 20% of residents speak a language other than English in their home, which is pretty low compared to the rest of Tucson, 13.7%. We are a pretty diverse city in some parts. So current Teatro Carmen, you can see how close it was of urban renewal happened versus where the building is at in red. If my connection, it's telling me my connection's unstable. So if I freeze up, just let me know. And then what the building looks like today. So at some point, somebody stuccoed over the front of the building and covered up those beautiful arches, but then nobody documented when that happened. The building itself ended up being purchased in 2021 by Herb Stratford, who I'm working with as the historian on that project. But before it was sold, the Rawlings, who had bought up the entire street, decided to sell off relics in the sale to show off the inside of the building. And that included cattle brands and support beams and foundational stones from Adobe around the area, places that they had bought and had remodeled not very well. And this is also this kind of profit that has turned in the barrio where it became kind of an attraction as people weren't even buying things in there because everything had sold out within the first hour or so. They were just there to take pictures of all of the relics of downtown. And it was like this, oh, like, look at all of these like Mexican artifacts that are in the barrio. And it was very much used for profit, not for education, especially with cattle brands. People found themselves buying back their family's cattle brands that had been taken from them for $50 each. And so there's this history in the barrio of using the Mexican-ness of the neighborhood and the diversity of the neighborhood for profit to bring in tourists and to bring in people who have money. And that's really what we're trying to combat with this. We want to turn it back into a community center, but make sure that it serves the people who are underserved in the community and who were intentionally pushed out of it. So what is the point? Teatro Carmen was used as a community center and as a gathering place for the neighborhood. It really was. Everyone showed up for one thing or another, whether it was a theater or boxing, or if they were there to take classes. And we had a conversation, I had a conversation with Herb, in which he said, how do we recreate the place? And as someone who was studying history and memory at the time, my answer was, you don't. We can't recreate the place because the people aren't there, the people have been pushed out, and we can't bring them back at this point. The cost of living driven by the price of the wanted Adobe houses is so high that people can't afford to live there, and that's why gentrification happened in the first place. We can try to bring them back. We can try to get more people into the area, but once an area is gentrified, it's gentrified, and so part of that also has been driven by the profit, trying to bring people into the area who have money to spend, which brought up ideas of profit versus authenticity. So in some respect, we'll never have the authenticity that we want because the people make the place and the people aren't there. And that's why we can't create the building as it was, certain parts of the building, and decide what we want to honor and what we want to educate people on. Because, sorry, I think, oh, okay, sorry. Because we can't make it how it was, but we have to correct the wrongs that have been told in the neighborhood. We can't continue telling this story that it's a Spanish neighborhood because Spanish is a connotation that was used, it's a colonizer term, to try to make it seem like Mexicans were white in their socioeconomic status. And we know that that's not true. And so part of that is picking things that we want to recreate and pay homage to, but knowing that we're never going to have that exact picture And that sometimes that might come as a sacrifice to profit, because I at least value telling the story and the history more than trying to sell it to people who just want to see a pretty theater. So my goals for that, using lived memory as a starting foundation, I'm really focusing on oral histories. COVID has gotten in the way of that a little bit, but going out into the community and finding people who know what this building was, because the building was last used in the 80s and the 70s, and people are still alive from that time period. They still have memories of what it looked like on the inside. They still remember what the neighborhood was like, especially there are people who are still alive who were kicked out of their homes there, who remember. And so going to them and saying, what did this mean to you? And how do you feel about what's going on, and getting their opinions so that we can be inclusive and how we're deciding to honor the neighborhood and making sure that it's true to what the people felt. Because the last thing we want to do is separate the neighborhood even more from the culture that was there and that made it memorable to the people who live there. So part of that is highlighting also who owned the building and when the building was owned. There's a lot of debate about that. The Elks Club tries to pretend they weren't a segregated Elks Club because now they're not. So acknowledging that there was also that division, the Americanization, how did it exist? It wasn't a pretty thing. It's not something that we should cover up though, because it's also important to understanding how the neighborhood is the way it is today. And so picking those characteristics and figuring out how to talk about them and understanding that it's gonna make people uncomfortable. That the whole part of redefining how we're talking about Mexicans and Mexican Americans in Tucson is gonna make people uncomfortable because that's how they're used to seeing it. And correcting those wrongs that have been historically told in Tucson, it's never easy. It's not usually very pretty. And there's definitely been pushback to it already. But if we don't make a conscious effort to include new communities and to reach out to them and to also educate those who maybe don't realize that the way that it's been told isn't exactly correct, then we'll never really make a difference. And we're just continuing to fall into that profit of, oh, this is a pretty Spanish building that is just named after some lady. And so in that, it's working with a lot of different people. I'm thankful that they have a board that has a lot of people of color on it, and that Herb is pretty understanding and bringing on, at the time I was a 20-year-old, to try to redefine exactly how we're gonna create and reset the neighborhood, at least a small part of it, to be inclusive in a way that it hasn't been yet. Okay, I'm sorry, that ran a little long. There's my bibliography if anybody.
Thank you, Ricky. Before we officially switch over to the Q&A, there's one quick question for clarification. The Teatro is profit making currently?
No, it's not.
Okay.
So they're planning on reopening it as a nonprofit.
Wonderful. All right. So if you can stop sharing that beautiful bibliography. So Johanna, I'd like to start with you. You know, and Ricky touched on it in her presentation as well about the commodification, you know, like LGBTQ month, it's June, or Hispanic Heritage Month, it's September. This is the month we tell our stories and we package it all nice, and that's pat on our back, we're done. So when you were reaching out and collecting the visitor feedback, did it also develop any specific strategies in your mind on how to organically and make, you know, habit build telling trans stories? You know, do you have like specific suggestions on integrating trans stories or trans storytelling? You know, like I know Susan Ferrantino's wrote a book about interpreting LGBTQ spaces, but that was written like a decade ago, and there hasn't been a ton of new research put out since then.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of the kind of queer museums, I mean, most of the research and work is like around sort of queer umbrella, rather than specifically focusing on gender diversity. But yeah, a lot of it is older than seems like it should be. I think it's, there's that like museum issue of, I think it's museums and culture. I'm trying to like scroll through my bibliography right now, but I'm not finding it. But that queer issue that so much like queer museum lit is pulled from is like from 2008 at this point, which seems, you realize that's longer ago than it maybe feels like it is. But so I feel like I had an advantage in this research because I was not associated with any of these museums at the time. I was a researcher in a grad program, reaching out as a community member rather than reaching out from a museum, which I think researchers and evaluators tend to have an advantage when they're not directly associated with the museum, because there's not that like happiness bias where participants want to make you feel good about the work you're doing, even if you're not necessarily doing a good job. I think the biggest thing is really connecting with communities first, to figure out how they want their stories to be told, what kinds of things that they're looking to see, and to empower communities to be involved with their own museums, their own institutions in their area. I think that a lot of the discomfort that I was hearing from participants when there were queer themes represented was, someone called it like, the person who made it maybe wasn't queer, but maybe they had a family member who was, so maybe that's probably fine, I'll just call Aunt Sue, was like how they had narrated this, how they were seeing this panel that they had seen. Or just felt like it wasn't coming from a place of authenticity. So having voices either from the artists themselves, if it's queer or trans art, or having some sort of interpretation or community work, seems to be the most organic way for it to go. So it doesn't feel like you're being kind of talked at. It's that the representation more feels like it's coming from within the community, particularly for local museums. These were museums within their own area. A lot of them, for example, Museum of History and Industry in Seattle, a lot of it is Seattle history, and participants live in the area. And so there's already that familiarity with the content. So it feels like an easy way to be able to kind of connect, because it's like we're telling the story of the place where you live, if you're connecting with local people there. Does that answer?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm just racking my brain. I can only think of one museum, and it's the Anishinaabe Museum in Michigan that has a community committee that works in partnership with the curators to create the content. But it definitely sounds like more collaboration and breaking, instead of having the museum as the hierarchy, figuring out how we're on a more level playing field.
Yeah, another actual Seattle recommendation for a similar setup is the Wing Luke Museum of Asian American Experience, where they also, everything is community curated. They actually don't have staff curators. It's all done by a committee. And that is also, when you go in those spaces, it really feels like this is something that is coming from the ground up rather than from top down. And their like community curation model is like, you can purchase a book from their store. Like anyone can do it. You can do it at any museum. It's not like guarded information. So that's at the Wing Luke. So I think that that's also a really good model for being able to kind of do a ground up community-based curation rather than having to do a lot of this back and forth or top-down kind of hierarchical model.
That's great. And so, Ricky, you touched, this building has history that's been ignored. It has history that is actively being avoided because it might cause discomfort. It's basically an onion of stories, and you're working to figure out how to tell them all. So it's really interesting that the space is intentionally shifting into a nonprofit space instead of taking advantage of the money-making opportunities in a gentrifying area. So, can you go a bit further into what kind of ways you're trying to make it so that the space is authentically telling the story and connecting to community so that they can recognize Tucson's full Mexican history versus the happy, shiny version that's portrayed?
Yeah. So a lot of people that I talk to, they're still really angry about the body owner, and rightfully so. As far as the stories going, getting those oral histories, what I've really found is the community is pretty close knit here. It's very, everyone knows everyone. And so one person who I reached out to, Alba Torres, who tried to stop urban renewal when it first happened, she already could point me, she could name names of like everyone I could go to start asking them about their histories. And so I think part of that is also going to them and saying, hey, how do we best represent you? Like, I don't want to just put panels on a wall because I don't think people will read them. Like, how can we display what it meant to you? And I think reaching out to people that way, because a lot of, at least what I found at the Mexican American Museum, is having objects to display and having those kind of talking points really gets people involved. But I think also better represents the culture and really what it means to people better than any picture that I could put on a display board that people would just read or just walk by. And so the hope for that also is that the museum, I know we had talked about it with Herb, he wants to have a part of the space just to tell the history of it, which I think also helps more than just expecting people to walk in, because there is a historical plaque out front that doesn't necessarily tell the whole history. It tells the pretty side of the history, but it's a historical plaque. So people go outside and they read it and they go, oh, that's what this is. And then they walk in. And so even if I don't know exactly the steps to get that removed, but even if we can't, that's my long-term goal. Even if we can't, if we can create an educational space inside in addition to the community space, and to make it free to access versus a lot of museums that are here that talk about Mexicans or Mexican Americans are paid to access, then we can grab a greater range of people and educate them on topics that maybe they wouldn't have paid to experience, but that are important to learn about regardless. Did that answer the question? I think it's part of it.
I love the moving beyond a text wall with a picture. How does someone who's alive want to be represented? I'm having fun. Like, how would I want to be represented? Johanna, I am curious. You brought up cultural competency training, and that has been a very big buzzword the past year, right? So I'm thinking a lot of the people who are tuning in today or will be watching the recordings, they're coming from underfunded nonprofits. They're coming from historic sites that may not even know where to start. Where does someone start? Have you found any good resources where people can just start to explore how to develop cultural competence training out there?
Yeah, so there's two resources that I would start with. I wish that these two were like combined and it would be like perfect. So 2019 American Alliance of Museums put out specifically a guide for trans workers in museums. So it's a 3-part guide. One is for institutions, like, if you're in HR, like what is the best way to handle an employee who is like coming out or working on transition? Like, how do you support them? There's one that's for coworkers. So how do you support your peer who is going through transition in the workplace? And there's one for the actual employee. Like, what are your rights? What should you do? How do you have these conversations? So that is a super valuable resource for, like you were saying, just like, how do you start having these conversations, beyond the museum content, but interacting with one another and being able to support trans people. This is specifically employees in museums, but just in general. So those are a really great resource, and it's recent. So I would, there's nothing in there that I'm like, but maybe not that. It's like great recommendations. And then 2016, also American Alliance Museums did an LGBTQ welcoming guidelines. It's like a big honker of a book. It's like everything from visitor services to collections to membership to like every single aspect of museum work as checklists on essentially it is partially not about not assuming anything. So, what is good language to use when you're dealing with like families in a museum? Like, instead of like, oh, where's mom and dad? Like, where are your adults that you're with? Margaret Middleton also has really good resources on neutral language in museums, mostly for dealing with families. So it's kind of twofold for dealing with families with gender diversity, different kinds of cultural backgrounds. But that AAM LGBTQ welcoming guidelines is a really good place to start there. It's less focused specifically on gender diversity, as are most of the resources that are currently available, unfortunately. But it's still a good jumping off point. It's just like a million checklists for every department in a museum that you could think of.
That sounds great. And I know it's supposed to be announced later this year, early next year. The American Association for State and Local History partnered with the National Council on Public History, where they've done a survey on gender discrimination and sexual harassment over the past 6 months or so. And they've been compiling all the information. They did a workshop at a conference earlier this year, but they're gonna have some tangible takeaways that sound maybe like a next steps to that AAM guide that I'm really excited about.
Once when Ricky is talking next, I will put a little list of the things that I just said very quickly in the chat.
And Ricky, there's this great question for you. Obviously through gentrification, people have been displaced. So how are past residents from the barrio being connected to the new community space, especially if they don't live in the neighborhood anymore?
Yeah, so the city of Tucson is it's like a layered thing. So residents themselves, the goal for the building is to be able to have any sort of community members be able to rent this, or not like rent, but to use the space for whatever they choose to use it for, be that like performances or I don't know if necessarily parties, but other sorts of celebrations. So in that way, that I think makes it a little bit more accessible versus other places that look more for profit. If you want to be able to use a community space, you have to pay like hundreds of dollars that people don't necessarily have. As for getting people to that area, that's a little bit more difficult. That area itself has some transportation nearby. The city of Tucson put in, it's like, I can't remember the exact name. It's one of those like electrical trams, and that runs nearby. It's about a block away. And that runs through all of central Tucson. And they're also building some new trolleys to try to get more people downtown in that area because everything's pretty close downtown. So there's more public transit in that area than there has been before. The city of Tucson starting to be more mindful about that. But I think outside, like once you start to get to southern Tucson, then it does get a little bit harder to get people there if they don't have their own transportation. Because what we're focusing on is making it accessible for people who want to be in the space. But that's a really good question, because now I have to bring that up. Like, how do we physically get them there? Because that is a really big challenge, because a lot of the people who I think really would want to see it got pushed out to southern Tucson, because that's how what are those called? The rules that say who you can and can't give buildings to. Oh, covenants. The covenants work.
Yeah.
In Tucson, in which anyone who was Mexican got pushed to South Tucson. So there's more public transit, but there needs to be even more. And I think that is a good conversation we're going to have specifically when we open, on how to get people from southern Tucson to downtown Tucson. And I think there was one other one.
Yeah, and there's a follow-up for you. Do you think the new gentrified community will react positively or negatively to the space?
I think it depends on who you're talking to. I don't think the Rawlings family is going to be really positive about it. He was already really upset with me when I questioned why he was selling off relics. So that part of the neighborhood is not going to be good. The other residents who did move into the neighborhood, and this is also a weird kind of thing that happens with gentrified neighborhoods, is that people tend to people who are the gentrifiers who move into those neighborhoods then don't want anybody else that's like them to move in because they moved in there for the culture that existed. And it's kind of a little weird to say, like, I want to be able to live in this culture, but I want it to stay here. Nobody else can come that's like me. So I think those types of people are really going to enjoy it. And the city of Tucson more and more has been trying to embrace the kind of like Mexican culture that exists here, and they're trying to play more into the diversity. And I think that really here we're starting to see a resurgence of support for histories that aren't usually told. So I think the majority of people are going to be excited. They're going to want to see these kind of performances and community events that the center can use. But I think there's going to be a very few, very loud people, like always, who are going to have some pushback on that, those who have profited off of what we're trying to counter.
Well, I know we went over, but I really enjoyed having this conversation with both of you. You know, it's important for us to think all the different ways we connect to community and tell stories and make people feel, and not just make them feel, but actually meaningfully integrate people into the process so that we're cultivating the inclusive cultural resource movement that we want, whether it's a museum, a historic site, an active storefront, whatever the case is. So thank you both so much for being here today. And there's only one session left for this year's Dismantle Preservation Unconference. We will be starting a revolution at 4 p.m. Eastern, and the panelists have told me that you are encouraged to bring your favorite alcoholic or non-alcoholic drink to that 4 p.m. Eastern talk. They said it is a happy hour. So we will happily be starting the revolution at 4 p.m. Eastern. Who knows what's going to happen? I'm excited for it. So thank you everyone for being here. I really appreciate it. And Ricky and Johanna for sharing your expertise. I'm really excited to dive deeper into both of the topics you presented on. Have a great day.